I think the real threat is really, no longer moving too slowly. It's actually moving way too fast without the governance and consistency, baked in. With, just the sheer volume of content flowing around with AI and user-generated content, brands that will win will not be the ones creating most content. It will be the ones who can, scale that content production while preserving brand coherence. And for that, you need systems in place to help you preserve brand equity, create operational efficiencies across the board as you scale, as your teams, markets, regions grow, and ultimately drive ROI from your content.
Infrastructure. Welcome back to The Digital Advantage. Today's episode is all about why context is king when it comes to merchandising across food and bev, retail, and fashion, and why these industries specifically demand unique content experiences. To understand this, we're shifting our focus from content creation and distribution to a critical new reality: content creation in the age of AI and how that is activated contextually in the market. I'm Ashley, and I'm joined today by Jovana, our Group Product Manager for CX for User Communities. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So, Jo, what is the big idea behind today's episode, and why does context matter so much right now?
Yeah, context is really important, both for humans and for AI. So if you have the asset before activating them in the market, you really need that context around as to, if you can use those assets under what conditions and rules, and that same context is relevant for people in your organization and outside of it, and also for AI to be able to execute on it accurately.
But doubling down on AI is everywhere when it comes to content production, content creation. But what is the downside of that nobody's really talking about?
Well, obviously, AI is, speeding up the content production. So while it's lowering the barrier to production, it's that content explosion and, exponential content growth brings exponential risks and brand exposure. So it really needs guardrails to make sure that while you're churning content, you're making sure that the content is of good quality and also on brand from the get-go.
So what are you seeing on the platform today that backs all of that up? What are the statistics around this explosion of content that we're seeing at Bynder specifically?
Well, I think we're seeing, the shift is definitely here. We're seeing brands trying to elevate their digital strategies to really respond to the demand of the market. Maybe just to put things in perspective, Bynder's been out and about in the market for well over a decade now, and yet we see, 50% of content is being uploaded in the last 18 months or so. I think that's just a testament to just the enormous content explosion in the past 2 years or so. We've seen also tremendous growth in user base, so we see that organizations are growing their teams and their employees. And I think an interesting fact is that we're seeing almost a half of our customers are leveraging AI technologies to some capacity and integrating it in their workflows today.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of different trends that are impacting businesses. It sounds like zooming out and looking at the industry. So with that, how does CX for User Communities really address these sort of macro trends that you're seeing? What are the main pillars that CX for User Communities offers?
So first and foremost, you need the foundation for it all, which is the system of record, your DAM, right? And then on top of it, you want the kind of narrative layer that brings context to that content, which is CX User Community. And if we start unpacking that, there's really three key fundamental pillars as part of CX User Community value proposition, starting from brand management. So you want to make sure that, with AI, we can churn much more content, but we want to make sure that we don't create, brand erosion and liability because we're churning content that's off-brand. So that's where brand management side of things becomes even more important in the AI era because you can document all of your, brand identity, your sonic identity and style guides and all of that in one central repository. Next to that, campaign execution. How do you go to market with those content? How do you activate them in the market? How do you enable your organization internally, but also externally, your distributors, your vendors, your marketing agencies of sorts. So that's where, campaign management side of things come in play. Again, having that central point, kind of one-stop shop where you can bring those assets into the context and also tailor it to the end consumer, right? So you're not going to serve up assets in the same way to say a person from a legal team versus a person from a sales team, as opposed to maybe an external partner. So you want to make sure that you're meeting your audiences where they're at and really tailoring that, content experience to them so that they're more likely to consume that content and do their jobs, which is what we're after. And then finally, last but not least, the knowledge management side of things, which is, what a lot of our customers are using 60 Community for is, just documenting their organizational knowledge. So anything about their company policies, their ESG policies, maybe even accessibility and anything that's related to the brand per se. It's a big and fundamental piece, again, feeding into, if we go back to the AI, the context, the brain that the AI needs to execute against, making sure that the content that it's producing or adapting is, on brand and within the regulations of your company and your brand.
So why is then just the storage and organization of assets no longer just enough? Like, what role does context really play?
That's a really good question. I think, storage answers one question, where is the asset? Yep. But it doesn't necessarily, tell you a bigger story to it. So how should I be using it? Should I be using it in the first place? Under which conditions and rules? And this is precisely where 60 Community comes in play, bringing that context in and really helping users perform, tasks at hand with that context. And again, obviously the branded component of it, making sure that it's on brand, in on-brand format, but also tailored to, again, that consumer of the content.
So let's start with retail. The day-to-day reality of these teams are, the intake of thousands of SKUs that are coming from hundreds of different vendors, and teams operating internally as human routers of imagery and content, various external partners asking for images, in-store managers that need them for their in-store displays, and the cost of these delayed or missing vendor images really leads to inventory issues and potential inventory exposure and markdowns if these things aren't solved for. So take all this, layer AI on top of it. Does this actually help, or is it actually just helping to make the problem worse?
Probably a little bit of both. Yeah, I think AI didn't create a problem in the first place, but it certainly did, amplify it. So, obviously, you can churn much more content. The barrier to production is significantly lowered with AI, but it doesn't necessarily ensure that, again, the content that you're producing or adapting, right, creating variations for, is on brand and, again, of quality. So I think, the Bynder's mission and vision just becomes even more critical in this world of just helping brands conquer the chaos of ever proliferating content that we're, seeing across the board.
So how does CX for user communities then step in and help fix this for a retailer?
Yeah, I think the problem is probably universal, and I would say mostly dependent on the size and the scale of the organizations. But it's, what we're seeing from customers is just the, problems of scattered information access, siloed folders, people not knowing where to go to find what they're after, and systems ultimately failing them. So where, Bynder and 60 Community come in play is really providing that foundational system of record, again, single repository where all your assets live, but also that, narrative layer that we spoke about earlier that, provides that context for the people who ask you how they should be using those assets and go and do their jobs.
Yeah, touching on that, I think a great customer example that comes to mind is Douglas. Yeah. Their transformation in terms of implementing CX for user communities has been amazing. They have over 40,000 pages that are opened on a monthly basis. They have over 1,000 active users of CX for User community across, over 20 plus countries. And they've, moved to this more dynamic brand portal, really from, like you're saying, this scattered PDF reality, and have really, implemented an internal training center and dedicated hubs for revenue driving events, like think Black Friday or something that's just so instrumental to their business. Yeah. So, I think that transformation is really incredible, but also, inspire brands. The scale is just amazing. And, they have such iconic brands, Dunkin' Donuts, Arby's, Buffalo Wild Wings, and, across, 32,000 locations. So that's an even larger operation, operating across, more sub-brands than this. Can you tell me a little more about that one?
Yeah, and maybe just before going to inspire brands, like you reminded me of something of Douglas in their example. I think they're just a brilliant example of how organizations, go from distribution of files, that, gives little to no context to users as to, again, what to do with those assets. But it also gives you nothing when it comes to traction. Are you generating any views? Are people consuming that? You're kind of blind. You're running blind when it comes to PDFs that are, obsolete the moment you download them. And when we go back and forth in emails like that, just, information goes there to die. And, having content experiences in Douglas's example is kind of one-stop shop where they can, have a single source of access for all of their campaigns and their brand identities across their different sub-brands, four different sub-brands that they manage across the 22 countries, and really preserving that kind of headquarters, central, brand management versus local adaptations to these sub-brands, and understanding the traction of that investment.
Being able to eliminate the need to duplicate content creation and really protect that brand consistency worldwide is just an incredible application
across
of
six different identities.
Amazing. So, moving a bit, shifting gears to fashion. So what makes the content challenge so unique for fashion brands specifically?
I think you touched on that, right? That premium component of it, which I think is definitely true for this specific sub-vertical. And kind of the use cases that come to mind from customers we've been speaking to is, how do they save costs, and can AI play a role there? Think of, editorial shooting, pretty expensive endeavors, right? So how do you repurpose that content and make it seasonal, or again, add, regional nuances to it. So as opposed to having models travel and shoot in different locations, you might be able to leverage AI today and replace backgrounds to make sure that they're adapted to different markets. So I think that's a really good fit for purpose for AI. Again, when done wisely and with the right context feeding into AI to make sure that's obviously those touch adaptations of content are obviously on brand.
AI obviously can do a lot of amazing things for these premium brands, but I also imagine that it can make it a bit tricky to maintain their brand identity as well. Like it does layer in, those concerns. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what those concerns could be?
I think, we mentioned the foundation, right? So system of record, but also your brand guidelines, almost your brand DNA. So if we kind of bring that back to Bynder, what you could be doing is you have your brand guidelines stored in your CX user community, right? So your brand identity, your imagery, photography, sonic identity, colors, fonts, you name it, all of the components, that comprise a brand. And then that's a living and breathing thing. If you feed that in as, almost again, brand DNA to say a compliance agent, that's something that can help you, kind of manage the life cycle of an asset from the moment it's uploaded, so you can run it at upload and ensure that the assets that are going into the DAM are from the get-go compliant. You can also ensure that, imagine transitions of a brand, like a brand refresh or a merger and acquisition, where brand compliance agent can play a role in as well, is to scan your entire DAM and make sure that only the latest identity is reflected in your assets and the old one is gone. And kind of going to the very end of the asset lifecycle to the delivery, think of activating those assets in the channels, different marketplaces, Zalando's, Macy's of the world, all of them have different specifications as to the file type maybe that you want to provide, or the background color, cropping and resizing formats, where again, you can provide those rules and kind of automate a lot of that work for them so that you can kind of bring that time back to brand managers, for example. We hear a lot that they spend ridiculous amount of times today, even more so with AI, just doing pixel policing, making sure that they're manually reviewing all the work that comes from, hundreds of agencies they work with, and also internal people, because now with the AI, pretty much everyone can create content, and again, exponential content growth, exponential brand exposure. So
really giving them their time back, and also CX for user communities really helping fashion brands to move fast while retaining control of their brand.
Absolutely, well said.
This makes me think of PUMA and how they've transformed their operations. They've done the things like eliminate the manual requests and the friction of endless emails, et cetera. But, also it's really unlocked the ability for global marketing teams and partners to be able to get instant autonomous access to approved campaign assets on a regional level. Can you elaborate a bit more on how this regional nuance, can be addressed with CX for user communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the kind of the key problems that CX user community solves for, really helping, globally operating brands to scale locally while preserving central kind of identity. So having a dedicated content hub or campaign hub for each of these regional or market nuances, you can ensure that the teams within can work autonomously while preserving that brand coherence. And then if we, tie in AI into that, like with that foundation in place, those guidelines for, again, global brand versus local adaptations, an example that's a little bit crazy but comes to mind, and I think it just really depicts well how AI can really help in scaling that. We have a globally operating customer who's come to us with a use case where in Poland, they can have women, being featured in imagery working at night. This is where AI can really be of help in, if it has context that, based on regulations in Poland market specifically, it can detect women depicted in imagery working at night, and scan that, highlight that for you, and even go as far as transform that imagery and making sure that the background is replaced with a daylight. So all of a sudden you're compliant.
So shifting gears a bit, obviously in fashion, brand identity, maintaining that premium brand is super important. But if we, think about CPG or food and beverage companies, of course their brand is also important there. But with this industry, you really layer in the governance and the regulatory considerations, which carry, not only brand identity risks, but also legal risks when you think about ingredients and labels and all of the things that need to be really considered. Can you elaborate a bit more on the considerations for these more regulatory brands?
Well, some use cases maybe that come to mind that are just, a good example of how, that can become a legal liability. So being food and bev, what comes to mind is alcoholic versus non-alcoholic beverages and who you expose that information and imagery to. So that being one thing, and also, whether bottles have caps on or not. So it's a specific regulation in specific regions. So it's, just interesting to see, as problems the customers come to us with and how we can solve that. So again, AI is a really strong candidate for fixing that problem, not only identifying, alcoholic versus non-alcoholic or cap on, cap off, and really also helping it tag it with appropriate, labels, and even transform it and create adaptations that are going to be, legally compliant. And, that ties really well into then creating region-specific, cultural adaptation-specific guidelines or content experiences that you want for activating in those markets.
This leads me to think of Pernod Ricard, who's one of our customers, who's also operating at just incredible scale. And how they're leveraging this is using CX for user communities to really accelerate that content discovery. So like you're saying, finding that content with the lid on, lid off, what have you, shortening their campaign turnaround times, et cetera. But really doing this across 240 brands in 160 markets, managing almost 140 terabytes of data with Bynder's AI capabilities within their CX for user community environments. So, really, again, just allowing for and enabling global teams to be able to activate those assets and maximizing ROI out of that content.
Absolutely, it's a really good example, and I'm very familiar with the use case of CX user community, and I know that they have templates for each of their brands that they have. So we're 240, as you said. So Absolute and Malibu and Jameson, they all have specific templates with placeholders, so they make sure that they're preserving kind of the group, premium beverages, premium alcohol, and in the same format, and then just populate specific parts and pieces, imagery and fonts that are pertinent to these brands. So it's that's how they scale across those.
You have to be able to, that's such a simple solution for, again, over 200 brands. So amazing. So in a space as regulated as food and beverage, AI, is it seen as more of a legal liability or also a marketing tool?
I think it depends on the implementation, right? Here at Bynder, we kind of firmly believe that, we're AI-powered, but always human-led. It comes down to the input you put in front of the AI and the context you feed in, right? Going back to the beginning of our conversation. So as long as the information you're putting in the brain of the AI, that it's going to execute, create good outputs and, accurate and on-brand. So. Foundation is important, but also having workflows there in place to ensure that you can probably automate 50% or maybe 80% of the work, but still have that human in the finish mile to make sure that everything is as it should be.
So really a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So for brands, what is the real risk of doing nothing in 2026?
I think the real threat is really, no longer moving too slowly. It's actually moving way too fast without the governance and consistency, baked in. With, just the sheer volume of content flowing around with AI and user-generated content, you want to make sure that you have regulations and constraints and guardrails around that content to make sure that you're producing on-brand content from the get-go. And if that's not in place, and the foundational guardrails are not in place, the inconsistencies are going to become systematic as opposed to occasional, and that ultimately leads to brand erosion. And it made me think of, a great presentation that I listened to just last week at Bynder Connect in New York City, where we had Danielle Giraud, who spoke about a very interesting concept about, 1% of the work being an idea, and the remaining 99% being execution, right? So if we just, unpack what we just spoke about, throughout this session is you really need the infrastructure in place to be able to take that idea, the easy part,
and activate it.
And make it a reality across the organization. So that's where, Bynder as the system of record and CX user community as almost a narrative layer on top of that, bringing and attaching context to that content comes in play, right? It's the infrastructure that helps you enable the teams, preserve that brand identity across the board, and really, help your organization internally and externally activate those assets in the market.
Yeah, so, it sounds like if I'm a CMO, I should really be making that business case for this type of infrastructure that is really, going to allow my brand to not just survive in this, a bit chaotic new reality, but actually thrive.
Absolutely, and I think we've touched on this earlier, but I don't think AI has, created this problem per se. It evidently, amplified it, and we're seeing even more content coming in, and just the explosion of content. But without the infrastructure in place to really manage that at scale, you're not going to have a problem with just not producing enough content. You're going to have a problem with producing content that's hurting your brand.
All right, Joe, last question. What is the one thing you want listeners to walk away with today?
Brands that will win will not be the ones creating most content. It will be the ones who can scale that content production while preserving brand coherence. And for that, you need systems in place to help you preserve brand equity, create operational efficiencies across the board as you scale, as your teams, markets, regions grow, and ultimately drive ROI from your content.
Infrastructure. Joe, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much for listening to our episode. If you want to learn more about CX for user communities and our customer examples that we've shared here today from Douglas, Pernod Ricard, and others, check it out at Bynder.com, and thanks for tuning in.